Hello and welcome to today's Open Dental webinar. We're going to cover, after a conversion, how to set up schedules and operatories when providers are assigned to their own operatories. If your providers share operatories, go ahead and see the other video linked in the description. So today we're going to cover how to set up operatories, the benefits of setting up schedules in Open Dental, and how to set up those schedules, and how to use the Update Provider on Future Appointments tool, as well as what treating provider assignment looks like when we're creating new appointments. So to start, we're going to cover how to set up operatories. We will navigate to Setup, Appointments, and Operatories. And from here, we have a few tools that we can use to set up our operatories. For example, the first tool that we've got here is the Combine tool. This will allow us to combine duplicate operatories. It does affect all appointments set up in those operatories. Depending on how many you have, it can take a while to run. The next window that will pop up after this window will let us select which operatory we'd like to keep. We cannot delete operatories, so what it's going to do is it's going to hide the operatory we don't want to keep. So we'll go ahead and hit OK. We can select whichever one is our operatory that we're wanting to keep. The other one will be hidden. And now, depending on your preferences in Open Dental, you will see another pop-up come up here. If you have appointments scheduled in both operatories that overlap, and your preference for appointments allow overlap is not enabled, they will need to be manually moved before the operatories can be combined. And you'll receive a pop-up that there's some appointment conflicts. We click OK, we can see those appointments that conflict, and we can decide to move those manually. Alternatively, if you do want appointments to overlap, you can come up here to Setup, Preferences, under Appointment General, and simply allow overlapping appointments. Now, when we try to run that tool, it's going to look a little bit different. Still receive the same pop-ups. Still choose the operatory we'd like to keep. But from here, we're just going to get the warning that it is going to move those appointments from Dr. Baxter 2 here to Dr. Baxter, the one we are keeping. Again, as you'll note on this pop-up, you cannot undo this. So you'll want to be really careful when you are using this tool. Anytime you see warnings like this, it can be beneficial to create a backup of your database before making big changes like this. I'm going to go ahead and hit yes. It's going to warn you that all of their appointments were merged into the operatory you decided to keep. And you'll notice the other operatory is now marked as hidden. From here, we can move our operatories up and down. For example, if I don't want to see this one on the top, just kind of move it down out of the way. And now we only have one Dr. Baxter operatory that will display. From here, we can also add operatories as needed. So our op name is going to be what displays on top of the operatory. And we can also set up an abbreviation for the operatory as well. This is a maximum of 5 characters, so whatever abbreviation makes the most sense to you, it will be what displays in several windows in Open Dental. We've got the Is Hidden checkbox, which can be used on any of our operatories if we're editing them. Again, if operatories cannot be deleted. But then from here, we can decide where our providers, hygienists, and all of our other settings are going to be set up. So our provider here, this is our primary provider. That's going to be the default provider assigned to appointments scheduled in the operatory. You should be using this unless providers share operatories. In that case, they will get assigned on the schedule setup. Go ahead and see the other video again if you're sharing operatories. From here, I can choose which provider is going to be primarily assigned to any appointments in that operatory. We can also set up the hygienist here. That's going to be the default hygienist assigned to appointments scheduled here in this operatory. If this was a provider-only operatory and hygiene procedures were scheduled in it, assignment will be determined by a preference in the appointments module, which we will discuss later on. From here, we can decide whether this is a hygiene operatory, which will make the hygienist assigned here to be considered the main provider for this op. This will also assign the hygiene color to the appointments. If we use the Set Prospective checkbox, this will mark the operatory for prospective patients only. Any patient scheduled in this operatory will be prompted to be changed to a prospective patient. This can be useful for tentative appointments for patients who have not been seen in the office previously. We can go over what that looks like in a little bit on a different operatory. From here, you'll notice a big section for our web Sched settings. This will be useful for if you're utilizing our web Sched e-service. Open Dental offers additional e-services to integrate with your practice, including the web scheduling, which will allow you to set up specific operatories for patients to schedule in online. And more information on that can be found in the description below. The last setting here is the op type. This can be set up in Open Dental definitions if you like to define an op type for your operatories, especially if you have quite a bit. So I'm going to go through and make sure all of our operatories are set up exactly as we like it. Since our providers are assigned to their own operatories, we want to make sure that everybody has an assigned provider in that operatory. We'll set this to our perspective so I can show you what that looks like as well. Now we'll go over this again in a moment, but just keep in mind that if you do assign providers in the schedule setup, it will override the provider assigned for the operatory during those time blocks. And that'll make a little bit more sense when we go over the schedule setup. Additionally, some offices prefer to keep an additional operatory on the schedule for note-keeping or overflow appointments. If you do want to create one of those like that, make sure to not assign a provider or hygienist to them. This ensures that appointment search excludes these additional operatories from displaying as an available time. Additionally, after a conversion, you may notice an unassigned operatory in your setup. You'll want to come into your reports, user query favorites, and run the Conversion Future Appointments by Operatory query. This is a report that shows us appointments where the conversion was not able to assign them to a particular op, and we need to manually move them to where it needs to go. We can print this out or export it, and then move those appointments manually. So I'll go ahead and find that appointment here and move it where I want it to go. You'll notice that because I moved it into a prospective operatory, the patient status will be set to prospective. And then from here, we can go back to that unassigned operatory and hide it, or if we prefer, we can reutilize it for another purpose. Next, we're going to look at some of the benefits of setting up a schedule in Open Dental. It ensures that provider assignment is accurate. It also helps in eliminating errors and assigning the production to the correct provider. It allows for quick and simple recall scheduling, which allows us to use the Make Recall and Make Family Recall buttons. Please note, if you do not have schedule set up, these buttons will not function as expected. It also allows us to quickly search for available time slots by a specific provider. So if I had an appointment on my pin board, I can use the search option to look for a particular provider, specify any provider or hygienist, and even set up specific dates and times that I want to look for, either before a certain time in the morning or after a certain time in the evening, and so on and so forth. Additionally, if you're utilizing any of the web Sched features, the e-services in Open Dental, you will need to have schedules set up in order for that to function. So let's go ahead and look at setting up those schedules. We're going to navigate to Setup, Schedules, and from here, we can start looking at all of our days. We'll go ahead and start with today. You'll notice that it's highlighted in red for us. We also have specific filters. If you do work on weekends, we can filter to the full week so that those weekends are available. Or if you only want to edit the weekends, you can switch to weekend and it'll only show Saturdays and Sundays. While we're looking at this window, you can also filter the schedules to specific days or turn off practice holidays and notes for those particular days. If for some reason I have a schedule in here and I want to get rid of it for the full week, I can use the Clear Week button to delete the entire week's schedule. Now we can double click on any day to start setting up the schedule. Mondays are usually best, but we can start with today. We'll simply double click here. And then at this point, we're just going to select the provider that we'd like to create a schedule for. And then we'll use the Add button. This will allow us to set up their start and stop time. Now keep in mind, if you're utilizing provider goals or the hourly production goals, we'll want to make sure that we schedule their break instead of using a blockout for that. Otherwise, it will kind of inflate those times. So we can say, oh, they're going to break at 1 o'clock. And then we're going to go ahead and set up their second start time to start at 2 o'clock and end at 5 o'clock. Now, we've already assigned the provider to the operatory that they're going to be scheduled in. So we don't need to select operatories in this section, unless you need to default to override the default operatory provider for some reason. From here, we can go through the rest of our providers and set up their schedule. And then we can go through and verify that these are all set up correctly. And that's a fairly simple schedule for one day. Now, we can move back and forth between days here if we'd like to use the arrows, or we can save it and go ahead and double click on the next day we'd like to edit. If we have a relatively simple schedule set up and we want to just simply copy and paste those to the rest of the days, we can do so. We can go ahead and select the day we'd like to copy and use our Copy Day button. Navigate to the day we want to paste it to, and we can even use the Repeat tool to repeat it as many times as we'd like. It'll warn us that we're going to replace schedules for all of those providers. And it'll also let us know that it's going to replace the schedule for those providers wherever it's pasted, if we had schedules in place over those already. We're going to go ahead and continue, and you'll notice that I've got a schedule for the next week or so as well. At this point, I can actually copy the whole week from Monday through Friday, navigate to our next Monday, and repeat that out as many times as I'd like. It's a good idea, before pasting out your entire schedule for the rest of the year or however long you would like to paste it for, to set up your holidays so that the pasting will ignore those particular days and you don't have to go back and delete them. So for example, we can go ahead and double click on any day that's a holiday, add the holiday note here, and set up any other holidays that we'd like to. You can also set up practice notes for those days as well, using the note button instead of the holiday button. Now, if I'm ready to go ahead and copy and paste my schedule, I will just grab the Monday, or the first day of the week that I'd like to grab, copy the whole week, and then navigate to the following week to paste it out as many times as I'd like. It's going to give us the same warnings as it does when we paste one single day. It'll let us know also that it's going to not replace the holidays on those dates. So it skipped right over our Memorial Day and our 4th of July. Now, if we have other holidays that we missed and we did not get set up, all we can do is navigate to that particular day. We can highlight all of our schedules and delete them, and then add our holiday note. Now, if your schedule is a little bit more complex, we do have a schedule setup examples manual page for different examples of how to set up schedule scenarios, and that's linked in the description below. Once we've set up our operatories and our schedules, you'll notice that the schedule will refresh, or after we refresh, the schedule will show up on our appointments module for the times that the provider is scheduled for. You'll also notice that our holidays are blocked out with a different color here. It makes it nice and easy to know when the provider is scheduled and available and what days we are closed. Additionally, after we've set up our schedules and operatories, we can come back into our setup, appointments, and operatories, double-click on any of our existing operatories, and take a look at this Update Providers on Future Appointments tool. Especially after converting, this will allow you to quickly change the operatories to the correct provider. After a final conversion, future hygiene appointments may have the hygienist assigned as the primary provider instead of the hygienist. Once these, again, providers and operatories are set up, you can use this button to update appointment providers to match the operatory providers. It's going to use some logic that will also be found in the manual page linked below. But if there is no provider scheduled, then the provider will update to the operatory provider. If there is a provider scheduled to that operatory, it will update to that scheduled provider. If there is no provider assigned to the operatory or scheduled in the operatory, the provider is not updated. So before running this tool, make sure that the operatory and provider and the hygienist are set up correctly. If you're utilizing schedules, ensure that the provider is assigned to the correct operatory under Setup and Schedules. Again, more often if you are sharing operatories found in the other video linked below, or if you need to override the scheduled provider in that operatory. Typically, you will also want to make sure to make a backup of the database and run this tool after hours. It can take quite a while to run occasionally, especially if you have a lot of appointments. And it's one of those changes that cannot be undone, which is why we like to make a backup as well. So if I were to click Update All, it's going to give us that same warning again that we recommend backing up and making sure that you run it after hours. And again, it can potentially change hundreds of appointments, which cannot be reversed. Well, they can only be manually reversed. You'd have to go through each appointment and manually change them. So it's going to ask if we are sure we want to run this tool. If we hit yes, it will just say whenever it's done, and those changes will be updated on the appointments. Now we can take a look at how providers are assigned to appointments when we're scheduling new appointments. As far as how the provider is assigned to the procedure, the first thing it's going to look at is the procedure itself, the procedure code itself. In lists and procedure codes, for example, if I have a particular code that is always done by one provider in the office, I can double-click on that code in our list and assign it to a specific provider. The next thing it's going to look at is the provider that is manually assigned to the appointment, using the drop-down found in the Edit Appointment window. So even though I'm scheduling in Dr. Ryder's operatory, if I select Dr. Baxter, it's going to use Dr. Baxter as the provider. And you'll notice again, Dr. Ryder's operatory is marked as prospective, so our patient was marked as prospective. The next thing it's going to look at is the provider that is scheduled in the operatory that the appointment has been scheduled in. For example, if I went into Dr. Jones's operatory and assigned someone else to that operatory for this day, it would use that provider. Otherwise, it's going to use the default provider for that operatory. If you are scheduling a prospective patient in a regular operatory, it's going to have you change that status from prospective to patient. The next thing it will look at, if there is no schedule or default operatory provider, the appointment will default to the patient's primary provider found in their patient information. You'll also notice that when we set up our operatories, we may not see all of the operatories if we added any. For example, we're not noticing our notes operatory or our Drew operatory. After we've done all of our setup, we need to make sure to go into Setup, Appointments, and Appointment Views to add those operatories to our views. And then once I refresh, it now displays all of our operatories. So we can take a look at, for example, if there is no provider scheduled and no provider assigned, it's using our Dr. Ryder as our primary provider because that is our patient's indicated primary provider in their patient information. Next, we're going to take a look at hygiene appointments. Now, the first thing that it's going to look at when we're creating an appointment for hygiene is the hygienist assigned to that appointment. If there's a hygienist assigned to the operatory, it will use that hygienist in the appointment, and the appointment will default to their color. If for some reason we are utilizing the override for our hygienist, it's going to use the provider, the hygienist, scheduled in the operatory before it uses the hygienist assigned to the operatory. Again, for this video, it is only if you happen to be using that for one day or for some reason. Otherwise, it will default to the hygienist assigned to the operatory. Now, if, for example, we had a hygiene operatory with no hygienist assigned and no hygienist scheduled in the operatory, the hygienist that gets assigned to the appointment by default will depend on a preference in Open Dental. By default, the preference is going to assign the patient's secondary provider, indicated on their patient information, as the hygienist on the appointment. Again, that can be found in the Family module and double-clicking on the patient information and the secondary provider indicated here. Now, the preference is found in Setup and Preferences, and under Appointment Appearance, the Force Ops Hygiene provider as secondary provider. That means if there is no hygienist assigned to the operatory, then no hygienist will be assigned to the appointment. Now you are ready to set up appointments, operatories, and schedules in your Open Dental after your conversion.
Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please call our support line at 503-363-5432 or access our complete online manual at opendental.com. And to make sure you're staying up to date on our latest training videos, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.